Thomas heard the veterinarian say his mare wouldn't survive the birth, watched the blood spread across the barn floor, and prepared to say goodbye to the last piece of his wife's legacy. What Esperanza did in the next 3 hours brought every single person in that barn to their knees in tears, but not for the reason anyone expected. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The night was cold and unforgiving when Dr. Samuel Herrera arrived at the small ranch nestled in the hills of rural Montana. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the weathered wooden fence posts and the anxious figure of Thomas Mitchell standing at the gate, waving his arms frantically. In his 32 years as a veterinarian, Samuel had seen countless emergencies, but something in Thomas's voice during that desperate phone call had made his blood run cold. "Please, Doc, you have to come now. It's Esperanza. Something's wrong with the birth." Those words echoed in Samuel's mind as he grabbed his medical bag and rushed toward the barn, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. Esperanza was no ordinary mare. She was the last living connection Thomas had to his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away 3 years earlier from a sudden illness that had left the entire community in mourning. Margaret had rescued Esperanza from an auction where the mare was destined for slaughter, her body thin and her spirit broken from years of neglect. Under Margaret's patient care, the mare had transformed into a magnificent creature with a coat as dark as midnight and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. When Margaret fell ill, she had made Thomas promise to care for Esperanza as if she were family. "She saved me when I needed saving," Margaret had whispered from her hospital bed. "Promise me you'll never let anything happen to her." Thomas had kept that promise with every fiber of his being, and now, as he led the veterinarian into the barn, his heart was shattering at the thought of losing the last piece of his wife's legacy. The scene inside the barn was one of heartbreaking desperation. Esperanza lay on her side in the straw, her massive body heaving with labored breaths. Sweat glistened on her dark coat, and her eyes, usually so calm and trusting, were wide with fear and exhaustion. 2 veterinary assistants, Elena and Rosa, were already there, having arrived earlier to help prepare for what should have been a routine birth. But nothing about this night was routine. Elena had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks, while Rosa stood frozen, her face pale as she watched the struggling mare. The air was thick with tension and the metallic scent of blood that had begun to pool on the white cloth laid out beneath the horse. Dr. Herrera knelt beside Esperanza, his experienced hands moving quickly as he assessed the situation. His face, weathered by decades of difficult calls and impossible decisions, grew increasingly grave with each passing moment. The foal was positioned wrong, twisted in a way that made natural delivery impossible, and Esperanza had already lost significant blood. Her vital signs were weakening rapidly, and the doctor could feel her strength fading beneath his touch. He looked up at Thomas, who stood watching with tears rolling freely down his weathered face, and the words that came out of his mouth felt like stones dropping into still water. "Thomas, I need you to prepare yourself. This mare won't survive the birth. The foal is severely malpositioned, and she's lost too much blood. I'm not sure I can save either of them." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Thomas felt his knees buckle. He grabbed onto a wooden post for support, his mind racing back to all the moments he had shared with Esperanza over the years. He remembered how she would nuzzle Margaret's hair every morning, how she would gallop across the pasture with a freedom that made his wife laugh with pure joy. He remembered the dark days after Margaret's funeral when Esperanza had refused to eat, standing at the fence where Margaret used to brush her, waiting for a woman who would never return. Thomas had spent weeks coaxing the mare back to life, sitting with her for hours, talking to her about Margaret, sharing his grief with the only other soul who seemed to understand his loss. They had healed together, man and horse, bound by love and loss in equal measure. But Esperanza was not ready to give up. As if she could understand the gravity of the doctor's words, something shifted in her eyes. The fear that had clouded them moments before gave way to a fierce determination that made everyone in the barn pause. She lifted her head, her nostrils flaring, and let out a sound that was part whinny, part cry, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of her being. It was as if she was declaring to everyone present that she would not accept this fate, not for herself and not for the life struggling to enter the world. Dr. Herrera had seen animals fight before, but never like this. There was something almost human in Esperanza's eyes, a mother's love so powerful that it seemed to bend the very laws of nature. Elena stepped forward, wiping her tears. "Doctor, isn't there anything else we can do? Any procedure, any chance at all?" Her voice trembled, but there was hope in it, a desperate plea for a miracle. Rosa nodded vigorously, her own resolve strengthening as she watched Esperanza's display of courage. Dr. Herrera looked at the mayor, then at Thomas, whose eyes held a prayer that words could not express. In that moment, surrounded by faith and determination, the veteran doctor made a decision that went against every textbook he had ever read and every statistic he had ever learned. "Get me my surgical kit," he said quietly, rolling up his sleeves. "If this mare wants to fight, then we're going to fight with her." Thomas moved quickly, grabbing the equipment the doctor needed while Elena and Rosa prepared the area around Esperanza. The mare seemed to sense that help was coming. Her breathing steadied slightly, and she turned her head to look at Thomas, her dark eyes meeting his in a moment of silent communication that transcended species. In that look was trust, love, and an unspoken promise. Thomas knelt beside her head, placing his hand gently on her neck. "You fight, girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You fight for your baby. Margaret is watching over you, I know she is. She wouldn't let you go like this." Outside, the wind howled against the barn walls, but inside, hope had taken root. The next few hours unfolded like a waking nightmare, each minute stretching into an eternity, as Dr. Herrera worked with a precision born of desperation and decades of experience. The barn, which had witnessed countless births over the years, now became a battlefield where life and death waged their ancient war. Thomas never left Esperanza's side, his hand constantly stroking her neck, his voice a steady stream of encouragement and memories. He told her about the first time Margaret had brought her home, how his wife had cried tears of joy watching the skeletal mare take her first hesitant steps into the pasture. He spoke of summer afternoons when Margaret would braid wildflowers into Esperanza's mane, singing old folk songs that made the mare's ears twitch with contentment. Each memory was an anchor, a reminder of why they were all fighting so hard. Dr. Herrera's hands moved with surgical precision as he worked to reposition the foal. It was delicate, dangerous work, and one wrong move could prove fatal for both mother and baby. Sweat dripped from his brow, and Elena was there to wipe it away, her earlier tears replaced by steely determination. Rosa monitored Esperanza's vital signs, calling out numbers that painted a grim picture but never quite crossed into hopeless territory. The mare was holding on, her body trembling with effort, but her spirit remained unbroken. Every time her strength seemed to waver, she would look at Thomas, and something in that exchange of glances would reignite her will to fight. It was as if she understood that giving up was not an option, not when there was a life depending on her. Outside, word had begun to spread through the small community. Despite the late hour, neighbors started arriving, drawn by some invisible force that seemed to call them to witness this moment. Old Mrs. Patterson, who had been Margaret's closest friend, was the first to appear at the barn door. She said nothing, simply clasped her hands together and began to pray, her lips moving in silent devotion. Soon she was joined by others, farmers and ranchers who had known Thomas and Margaret for years, people who understood the sacred bond between humans and the animals they loved. They formed a semicircle outside the barn, their presence a testament to the community's collective hope, their whispered prayers rising into the cold night air like incense. Inside, the situation grew increasingly critical. Esperanza had been in labor for nearly 6 hours now, far longer than any horse should endure. Her body was exhausted, pushed beyond limits that should have broken her long ago. Dr. Herrera had managed to partially reposition the foal, but complications kept arising, each one more challenging than the last. The umbilical cord had become wrapped around the foal's neck, cutting off its oxygen supply. Time was running out, and everyone in the barn knew it. Thomas could see the doubt flickering in the doctor's eyes, the professional resignation beginning to set in. But then Esperanza did something that no one expected. She gathered what remained of her strength and pushed, a mighty effort that rippled through her entire body. The push was accompanied by a sound that Thomas would never forget, a cry that seemed to contain all the love and determination a mother could possess. It was primal, powerful, and utterly heartbreaking. Dr. Herrera, caught off guard by the sudden progress, quickly adjusted his position and worked frantically to free the foal from the tangled cord. Elena rushed to assist, her small hands proving invaluable in the delicate procedure. Rosa called out that Esperanza's heart rate was dropping, that they were losing her, but still the mare pushed. She pushed with everything she had left, refusing to surrender to the darkness that was closing in around her. And then, like the breaking of dawn after the longest night, a new sound filled the barn. It was weak at first, barely audible above Esperanza's labored breathing, but it was unmistakable. The cry of a newborn foal, struggling to take its first breaths in a world it had fought so hard to enter. Dr. Herrera held the tiny creature in his arms, quickly clearing its airways and stimulating its breathing. The foal was small, much smaller than it should have been, its coat a beautiful silver gray that seemed to glow in the lamplight. But it was alive. Against all odds, against every prediction and probability, the foal was alive. The celebration, however, was short-lived. Esperanza's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The birth had taken everything from her, and now her body was failing. Her breathing became shallow, her eyes began to lose their focus, and the strength that had carried her through the impossible night was finally fading. Dr. Herrera handed the foal to Elena and rushed back to the mare's side, but his expression told Thomas everything he needed to know. There was nothing more medical science could do. Esperanza was dying. Thomas collapsed beside her, gathering her massive head into his lap as tears streamed freely down his face. "No, no, no," he sobbed, his voice raw with grief. "You can't leave me too. Please, Esperanza, please don't go." The mare's eyes, still holding that remarkable intelligence that had defined her, found Thomas's face. In them he saw no fear, only peace and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. She had done what she set out to do. She had brought her baby into the world. Now she was ready to rest. But Elena, who had been caring for the newborn foal, noticed something extraordinary. The tiny creature, barely minutes old and still unsteady on its spindly legs, was moving toward its mother. It wobbled and stumbled, falling twice, but each time it got back up and continued its journey. When it reached Esperanza, it nuzzled against her neck, making soft sounds that seemed almost like whispered secrets. The mare's eyes, which had been closing, suddenly opened wide. She turned her head toward her baby, and in that moment, something miraculous happened. Her breathing, which had been fading, began to steady. Her heart rate, which had been dropping, started to climb. Dr. Herrera stared at his monitors in disbelief. "This is impossible," he whispered, checking and rechecking the readings. "Her vitals are stabilizing. I don't understand." But Thomas understood. He understood that love, true love, was the most powerful force in the universe. Esperanza had found her reason to keep fighting. Her baby needed her, and she would not abandon her child the way she herself had once been abandoned. As the first rays of morning light began to filter through the barn's weathered boards, mother and baby lay together under the straw, their hearts beating in perfect synchronization, two souls bound by a bond that death itself could not sever. The news of Esperanza's miraculous survival spread through the small Montana community like wildfire and dry brush. By noon the following day, people from neighboring towns had heard the story and were making their way to Thomas Mitchell's ranch, drawn by an inexplicable need to witness the miracle for themselves. They came bearing gifts of hay and grain, blankets and well wishes, their faces filled with wonder and hope. In a world that often seemed dominated by tragedy and loss, the story of a dying mare who had defied death for the love of her foal touched something deep within the human spirit. It reminded people that miracles were still possible, that love could triumph over the most impossible odds. Thomas, exhausted from his sleepless night but unable to rest, received each visitor with humble gratitude. He led them to the barn where Esperanza lay recovering, her newborn foal curled against her side in a picture of perfect contentment. The mare, though still weak, seemed to draw strength from every visitor who came to see her. She would lift her head, her dark eyes meeting theirs with a dignity that left many visitors in tears. Some reached out to touch her, their hands trembling as if they were touching something sacred. And perhaps they were. Perhaps in that barn, in the presence of a mother's unconquerable love, they were indeed touching the divine. Dr. Herrera returned 3 times that first day to check on his miraculous patient. Each visit left him more amazed than the last. Esperanza's recovery defied every medical principle he had learned in his long career. Her blood loss alone should have been fatal, yet here she was, growing stronger by the hour. He ran tests, checked vitals, and examined every aspect of her condition, but science could not explain what he was witnessing. Finally, on his 3rd visit, he set down his stethoscope and simply shook his head. "In 32 years, I have never seen anything like this," he told Thomas, his voice heavy with emotion. "By every measure I know this mare should not be alive, but here she is, defying everything I thought I knew about medicine." Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving Esperanza. "Margaret always said she was special," he replied softly. "She said that Esperanza had a spirit that could not be broken. I never truly understood what she meant until last night." He paused, remembering his wife's gentle smile, the way she would talk to the mare as if they shared some secret language. "I think Margaret knew, somehow. She knew that Esperanza was destined for something extraordinary." Dr. Herrera placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between 2 men who had witnessed something that transcended ordinary experience. No more words were needed. The foal, whom Thomas named Hope in honor of the emotion that had carried them all through that terrible night, proved to be as remarkable as her mother. Despite her difficult entry into the world, she displayed a vitality that amazed everyone who saw her. Within hours of her birth, she was standing on her own, her silver-gray legs steadier than anyone had expected. By the end of the first day, she was nursing eagerly, her small tail twitching with satisfaction as she drew nourishment from her mother. Esperanza watched her daughter with eyes full of pride, occasionally reaching down to nuzzle the foal's neck in gestures of pure maternal love. The bond between mother and daughter was evident to everyone who witnessed them. Hope rarely strayed more than a few feet from Esperanza's side, and the mare's eyes followed her baby's every movement with vigilant attention. When Hope stumbled during her early attempts at walking, Esperanza would whinny softly, encouragingly, as if coaching her daughter through each challenge. When the foal finally mastered the art of walking without falling, the mare's proud snort echoed through the barn, bringing smiles to the faces of all who heard it. It was as if Esperanza knew that every milestone Hope achieved was a victory, a testament to the sacrifice she had made to bring her into the world. But as the days passed and the initial excitement began to settle, Thomas found himself grappling with emotions he had kept buried for years. Watching Esperanza care for Hope stirred memories of Margaret that he had tried to lock away, memories too painful to confront. He remembered how Margaret had always dreamed of breeding Esperanza, of watching her give birth to a foal that would carry on her legacy. She had spoken of it often during the early days of her illness, when hope for recovery still existed. "Imagine it, Thomas," she would say, her eyes bright despite her weakening body. "A little foal running through our pastures, carrying Esperanza's spirit into the future." Those dreams had died with Margaret, or so Thomas had believed. Now, standing in the barn watching Hope take her first tentative steps into the pasture, Thomas felt those dreams resurrecting within him. Tears streamed down his face as he realized that Margaret's vision had finally come true, 3 years after her passing. It was as if his wife had reached across the veil of death to orchestrate this miracle, to give him a reason to hope again. He looked up at the sky, his lips moving in silent conversation with the woman he had loved and lost. "You did this, didn't you?" he whispered. "You sent us hope. You knew we needed her." A gentle breeze stirred the air around him, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers, Margaret's favorite. Old Mrs. Patterson, who had been visiting daily since the miraculous birth, noticed the change in Thomas. She had watched him struggle through the years since Margaret's death, had seen him go through the motions of living without truly being alive. But now there was a light in his eyes that had been absent for so long, a spark of purpose that seemed to grow stronger each day he spent with Esperanza and hope. She approached him one afternoon as he stood at the pasture fence, watching the mare and foal graze in the golden sunshine. "Margaret would be so proud," she said gently, standing beside him. "Of Esperanza, of hope, but most of all, of you." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. For the first time in 3 years, he felt truly alive. The weeks that followed the miraculous birth were filled with moments of joy that Thomas had thought himself incapable of experiencing again. Each morning, he would wake before dawn and make his way to the barn, where Esperanza and hope awaited him with what he could only describe as eager anticipation. The mare had regained much of her strength, her coat once again gleaming with the healthy sheen that had always characterized her. Hope was growing at an astonishing rate, her silver-gray coloring developing beautiful dappled patterns that made her look like a creature from a fairy tale. Together, mother and daughter had transformed the ranch from a place of painful memories into a sanctuary of healing and renewal. Thomas found himself talking to the horses for hours at a time, sharing stories about Margaret, about the life they had built together, about the dreams they had shared. Esperanza would listen with her characteristic patience, her dark eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond what any animal should possess. Hope, still young and full of boundless energy, would prance around them, occasionally stopping to nuzzle Thomas's pockets in search of the treats he always carried. These moments became sacred to Thomas, a daily ritual that reconnected him with the love he had lost and the hope he was slowly rediscovering. The community continued to rally around the Mitchell Ranch, offering support in ways both practical and profound. Neighbors who had drifted away during the dark years after Margaret's death began returning, their visits rekindling friendships that Thomas had allowed to wither. The local church organized a fundraiser to help with the veterinary bills that had accumulated during Esperanza's crisis, raising far more than was needed. The excess funds were used to improve the barn and pastures, ensuring that Esperanza and Hope would have the best possible care for years to come. It seemed that the miracle of that terrible night had not only saved 2 lives, but had also breathed new life into an entire community. But not everyone in the county was celebrating the miracle at the Mitchell Ranch. Victor Harmon, a wealthy landowner whose property bordered Thomas's modest spread, had long coveted the Mitchell land. For years he had watched Thomas struggle after Margaret's death, waiting patiently for the moment when financial hardship would force him to sell. Victor was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted was to expand his cattle operation across the Mitchell property. The small ranch sat atop a natural spring that fed a creek running through both properties, and controlling that water source would give Victor significant advantages during the dry summer months. The news of Esperanza's miracle and the community's outpouring of support had reached Victor's ears, and it did not please him. He had expected Thomas to continue his downward spiral, to eventually give up and accept the generous offers Victor had been making for years. Instead, the man seemed revitalized, his ranch transformed from a neglected reminder of happier times into a thriving symbol of hope and resilience. Victor's jaw tightened as he watched the parade of visitors making their way to the Mitchell property, their cars kicking up dust on the road that wound past his own pristine fences. Something had to be done. It was a Thursday afternoon when Victor Harmon's black pickup truck rolled up the Mitchell driveway for the first time in months. Thomas was in the pasture with Esperanza and Hope, working on basic training exercises that would help the young foal develop trust and responsiveness. He looked up at the sound of the approaching vehicle, his expression neutral but his guard immediately raised. Victor Harmon never visited without an agenda, and that agenda had never aligned with Thomas's best interests. He gave Esperanza a reassuring pat and walked toward the fence where Victor was climbing out of his truck, his expensive boots gleaming incongruously against the dusty ground. Victor approached with the practiced smile of a man who had perfected the art of hiding his true intentions behind a mask of neighborly concern. "Thomas, good to see you," he called out, extending his hand. I heard about the excitement around here. Quite a story, that mare of yours. Thomas shook the offered hand briefly, his grip firm, but his expression guarded. Word travels fast, he replied simply, offering nothing more. Victor leaned against the fence, his eyes scanning the property with the calculating gaze of an appraiser. Beautiful land you've got here. Margaret always did have an eye for beauty. The mention of Margaret's name sent a flash of anger through Thomas, but he kept his composure. He knew Victor well enough to recognize manipulation when he saw it. "What can I do for you, Victor?" he asked, cutting through the pretense. Victor's smile widened, though it never reached his cold eyes. "Straight to business, I appreciate that. Look, Thomas, I know times have been hard for you. Losing Margaret, trying to keep this place going on your own. I've always admired your determination, even when others thought you should just let go." He paused, letting his words sink in. But determination doesn't pay the bills, does it? Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Behind him, he heard Esperanza whinny softly, as if sensing his rising tension. "I'm managing just fine, Victor. The community has been more than generous." Victor nodded, his expression shifting to one of feigned concern. "Yes, I heard about the fundraiser, very touching. But charity can only take you so far, Thomas. What happens next year when another crisis hits? What about the year after that?" He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document. "I've had my lawyers draw up a new offer. It's substantially more than the last one. Enough for you to start fresh somewhere else, without the burden of this place weighing you down." Thomas stared at the document, but made no move to take it. His mind raced with memories of Margaret standing in this very spot, her hair blowing in the wind as she gazed out at the land they had built their dreams upon. She had loved every inch of this property, had poured her heart and soul into making it a home. The thought of handing it over to a man like Victor Harmon, who saw nothing but dollar signs and strategic advantages, made his stomach turn. He looked up, meeting Victor's expectant gaze with steady resolve. "This land isn't for sale, Victor. Not now, not ever." Victor's smile faltered for just a moment before the mask slipped back into place. Victor Harmon's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly as he processed Thomas's refusal. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the veneer of neighborly concern giving way to something far colder beneath. He folded the document and slipped it back into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, his movements conveying a patience that felt more threatening than reassuring. "That's disappointing to hear, Thomas," he said, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there before. "I was hoping we could settle this matter amicably between neighbors. But if you insist on being stubborn, well, there are other ways to approach these situations." He let the words hang in the air, their implications clear. Thomas stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated by a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. "Is that a threat, Victor?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Victor laughed, a hollow sound that held no warmth. "A threat? Of course not. I'm simply pointing out that circumstances change, Thomas. Properties that seem secure today can become liabilities tomorrow. Accidents happen, markets shift, regulations get enforced." He glanced toward their pasture where Esperanza and Hope were grazing peacefully. "And animals, well, they can be unpredictable, can't they? Especially horses with complicated medical histories." The implication struck Thomas like a physical blow. He stepped closer to Victor, close enough to see the calculation in the other man's eyes. "If anything happens to my horses, Victor, anything at all, you'll answer for it. That's not a threat. That's a promise." Victor raised his hands in mock surrender, his smile returning with serpentine smoothness. "Easy, Thomas. I'm just making conversation. No need for hostility between neighbors." He turned and walked back to his truck, pausing at the door to deliver one final volley. "Think about my offer. Sometimes the wise choice isn't the one our hearts want us to make. I'll be in touch." As Victor's truck disappeared down the driveway, Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Mrs. Patterson standing beside him, her weathered face creased with concern. She had witnessed the entire exchange from the porch, having stopped by with a fresh batch of her famous apple pie. "That man has always been trouble," she said softly. "Margaret never trusted him, you know. She used to say his smile reminded her of a snake waiting to strike." Thomas nodded, his eyes still fixed on the settling dust where Victor's truck had been. "She was right about a lot of things," he replied. "I just wish she was here to help me figure out what to do about him." Mrs. Patterson patted his arm with the gentle authority of a woman who had seen enough of life to understand its complexities. "You do what Margaret would have done, Thomas. You stand your ground, you protect what matters, and you trust that goodness will prevail." She paused, looking toward the pasture where Esperanza had moved closer to the fence, her ears pricked forward as if listening to their conversation. "That mare fought death itself for her baby. I don't think she'd take kindly to anyone threatening her home." Thomas managed a small smile, drawing comfort from the old woman's wisdom. She was right, of course. Margaret would never have surrendered to intimidation. That night, Thomas made his rounds of the property with extra vigilance. He checked every fence line, inspected every lock, and installed motion sensor lights near the barn that would alert him to any nighttime visitors. Esperanza watched his preparations with quiet attention, her dark eyes following his movements with understanding. When he finally sat down on a hay bale, exhausted from hours of work, she walked over and rested her great head against his shoulder. The gesture was so human, so filled with empathy, that Thomas felt tears spring into his eyes. "We're in this together, aren't we, girl?" he whispered. Esperanza responded with a soft breath that warmed his neck. Hope, ever curious about the activities of the adults around her, trotted over to investigate. She was nearly 3 months old now, her body filling out with healthy muscle, her personality emerging as a delightful combination of her mother's dignity and an irrepressible playfulness all her own. She nudged Thomas's pocket, searching for treats, and when he produced a carrot, she accepted it with enthusiastic gratitude. Despite the shadow of Victor's threat hanging over them, Thomas felt a surge of determination. This family, unconventional though it was, had been forged in the fire of adversity. They had faced death and emerged victorious. They would face this challenge the same way. The following days brought an uneasy calm to the Mitchell ranch. Victor made no further appearances, but his presence seemed to linger like a dark cloud on the horizon. Thomas found himself jumping at unexpected sounds, sleeping fitfully, and constantly scanning the boundaries of his property for signs of intrusion. The community, sensing that something had shifted, rallied even closer around him. Neighbors took turns driving past the ranch at night, their headlights sweeping across the property in silent patrol. The local sheriff, a gruff man named Bill Henderson, who had been a friend of Thomas's father, stopped by to assure Thomas that he was watching Victor closely. But it was Esperanza who proved to be the most vigilant guardian of all. The mare seemed to sense the threat that hung over her home, and her behavior changed accordingly. She became more alert, her ears constantly swiveling to catch distant sounds, her eyes scanning the perimeters with an intensity that bordered on human awareness. At night, she positioned herself between Hope and the barn door, her body a living barrier against whatever dangers might approach. Thomas noticed these changes and marveled at them. It was as if the mare understood that the fight for survival had not ended with her miraculous recovery, that new battles lay ahead. One morning, as dawn painted the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas stood at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee warming his hands. He watched Esperanza and Hope moving through the pasture, their silhouettes backlit by the rising sun. In that moment, despite everything, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Whatever Victor Harmon had planned, whatever challenges lay ahead, Thomas knew he would face them with the same courage Esperanza had shown on that terrible night. He would fight for his home, for his horses, for the legacy Margaret had entrusted to his care. And like Esperanza, he would not surrender. The trouble began exactly 2 weeks after Victor Harmon's visit, arriving not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet devastation of bureaucratic machinery. Thomas received the letter on a Tuesday morning, an official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the county health department. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open, some premonition warning him that the contents would not bring good news. The letter informed him that a complaint had been filed regarding potential health code violations at his property, specifically concerning the keeping of livestock in conditions that posed a risk to public safety. An inspection was scheduled for the following week, and failure to comply with regulations could result in fines, forced removal of animals, or both. Thomas read the letter 3 times, each reading fueling his anger more than the last. He knew immediately where the complaint had originated. Victor Harmon's fingerprints were all over this, his threat to use regulations as a weapon now manifesting in cold bureaucratic reality. The ranch was clean, well-maintained, and had passed every inspection it had ever faced. But Thomas also knew that a determined adversary with deep pockets could find violations where none existed, could pay for experts who would testify to problems that had never been problems before. The game Victor was playing was an old one, using the machinery of government to accomplish what threats and money had failed to achieve. He drove into town that afternoon, the letter burning a hole in his pocket. His first stop was the county health department, where a sympathetic clerk named Susan confirmed what he already suspected. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but its detailed knowledge of the property's layout and operations suggested someone with intimate familiarity with local ranching affairs. Susan couldn't officially point fingers, but her expression said everything her words could not. "Just make sure everything is in order for the inspection," she advised quietly. "Document everything, take photographs, keep records of all your maintenance and veterinary visits. These anonymous complaints sometimes fall apart when they meet actual evidence." Thomas's next stop was Sheriff Henderson's office, where the lawman listened to his concerns with growing irritation. Bill Henderson had known Victor Harmon for 30 years and had long harbored suspicions about the man's methods. There had been other ranchers over the years who had found themselves facing unexpected legal troubles after refusing Victor's offers, other properties that had mysteriously become unprofitable just when Victor was positioned to snap them up. But suspicion was not proof, and Victor was careful to keep his hands clean of any direct involvement. "I can't do anything without evidence, Thomas," the sheriff said with genuine regret. "But I'll increase patrols around your property, and I'll make sure Victor knows we're watching him closely." The community's response to Thomas's predicament was swift and overwhelming. Word spread quickly through the network of neighbors and friends who had rallied around him since Esperanza's miracle, and within days volunteers were arriving at the ranch to help prepare for the inspection. Fences were repaired, buildings were painted, records were organized with meticulous care. Dr. Herrera provided comprehensive documentation of Esperanza's health history and Hope's development, certifying that both animals were receiving exemplary care. Mrs. Patterson coordinated a letter-writing campaign, gathering testimonials from dozens of community members, attesting to Thomas's character and the condition of his property. Through it all, Esperanza seemed to sense the heightened tension around her. She watched the flurry of activity with calm attention, her dark eyes following the volunteers as they worked. When Thomas would pause to rest, she would approach him with the gentle persistence that had characterized their relationship since the beginning. Her presence was a constant reminder of why he was fighting, of what was at stake. Hope, now fully weaned but still close to her mother, had begun showing early signs of the intelligence and spirit that made Esperanza so remarkable. She would follow Thomas around the property, her curious nature drawing her into every project and activity. These moments of innocent joy provided brief respites from the stress that otherwise consumed Thomas's days. The night before the inspection, Thomas sat alone in the barn, unable to sleep. The preparations were complete, every possible precaution taken, but anxiety still gnawed at his stomach. He had done everything right, had lived his life with integrity, and cared for his animals with devotion. Yet here he was, facing the possibility of losing everything because a wealthy man could not accept being told no. The injustice of it burned within him, a fire that threatened to consume his hope if he let it. He thought of Margaret, of how she would have handled this situation. She had always been the stronger one, the one who faced adversity with grace and determination. Esperanza stirred in her stall, and Thomas looked up to find her watching him. In the dim light of the barn, her eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly wisdom. She nickered softly, the sound carrying across the quiet space like a whispered reassurance. Thomas rose and walked to her stall, pressing his forehead against her warm neck. "I don't know if I can do this without her," he confessed, his voice breaking. "Margaret always knew what to do, always found a way through. I'm just a simple farmer who got lucky enough to love her." Esperanza responded by turning her head, her soft muzzle brushing against his cheek in a gesture that felt remarkably like a kiss. In that moment, Thomas felt something shift within him. Perhaps it was his imagination, perhaps it was the stress and exhaustion playing tricks on his mind, but he could have sworn he caught the faint scent of wildflowers drifting through the barn. Margaret's scent, the one that had surrounded her always, that had lingered in their home for months after her passing. A warmth spread through his chest, dispelling some of the cold fear that had taken root there. "You're still here, aren't you?" he whispered to the empty air, "still watching over us, still fighting alongside us." The breeze stirred, carrying with it what might have been an answer, and Thomas found himself smiling through his tears. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it with the strength of those who loved him, both seen and unseen. The morning of the inspection dawned gray and overcast, clouds hanging low over the Montana hills like a shroud of uncertainty. Thomas was up before first light, making one final round of the property, checking every detail with the nervous energy of a man whose fate hung in the balance. The volunteers had done remarkable work, and the ranch looked better than it had in years. Fresh paint gleamed on the barn doors, fences stood straight and sturdy, and every piece of equipment was clean and properly stored. Even the pastures seemed greener somehow, as if the land itself had risen to meet the challenge. Yet despite these reassurances, Thomas could not shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The inspector arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to his hand. His name was Harold Winters, and his reputation preceded him as a by-the-book bureaucrat who took his job with deadly seriousness. Behind him came a second vehicle, and Thomas's heart sank as he watched Victor Harmon emerge from his black pickup truck. The wealthy rancher had come to witness his handiwork, his presence a silent reminder of who had set these wheels in motion. Victor nodded at Thomas with a smile that dripped with false cordiality, then positioned himself at a distance where he could observe without appearing to interfere. Harold Winters approached Thomas with professional detachment, extending his hand in a perfunctory handshake. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm here to conduct the inspection as outlined in the notice. I'll need access to all structures housing livestock, feeding areas, waste management systems, and any water sources on the property." His tone was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man who had conducted thousands of such inspections without ever considering the human impact of his findings. Thomas nodded and gestured toward the barn. "Everything is open and ready, Mr. Winters. I have documentation prepared for anything you need to verify." The inspection proceeded methodically, Harold making notes on his clipboard while Thomas followed, answering questions and providing records when requested. Every stable was examined, every feeding trough measured, every inch of fencing scrutinized for potential hazards. Thomas watched the inspector's face for any sign of his conclusions, but Harold's expression remained maddeningly neutral throughout. Victor Harmon trailed at a distance, occasionally exchanging words with Harold that Thomas could not hear. Each whispered conversation sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Thomas's already frayed nerves. They were in the main barn when the inspection took an unexpected turn. Harold had been examining the stall where Esperanza and Hope were housed, his measuring tape out as he checked dimensions against some standard only he knew. Esperanza watched the stranger with wary attention, her body positioned protectively between the inspector and her foal. Hope, sensing her mother's tension, pressed close against Esperanza's side. Harold reached toward the gate, apparently intending to enter the stall for a closer examination, when Esperanza suddenly moved. She stepped forward, placing herself directly in front of the gate, her ears flattened against her head in unmistakable warning. Harold froze, his hand still extended toward the latch. "Mr. Mitchell, please control your animal," he said, a tremor entering his previously steady voice. Thomas moved quickly to Esperanza's side, placing a calming hand on her neck. "Easy, girl. He's not going to hurt Hope." But Esperanza did not relax. Her eyes remained fixed on Harold with an intensity that made the inspector take a step backward. There was something in her gaze that went beyond simple animal protectiveness, something that seemed almost knowing, as if she could see through Harold Winters to the machinations that had brought him here. Victor Harmon stepped forward, his voice dripping with concern. "Perhaps this demonstrates exactly the kind of dangerous conditions I reported. An aggressive animal like that poses a clear risk to public safety." He turned to Harold with practiced sincerity. "This is precisely why I felt compelled to file the complaint. Someone could be seriously hurt." Thomas felt his anger surge, but before he could respond, something remarkable happened. Hope, the small silver-gray foal who had been hiding behind her mother, suddenly emerged. She walked directly toward Victor Harmon, her young eyes meeting his with a directness that made the wealthy rancher falter in his performance. For a long moment, the foal simply stood there, staring at Victor with an intensity that seemed to pierce his carefully constructed facade. Then she turned and walked to Harold Winters, nudging his hand with her soft muzzle in a gesture of pure innocence. The inspector, caught off guard by this display of gentleness, instinctively reached out to stroke the foal's neck. Hope leaned into his touch, her eyes half closing with pleasure. The tension in the barn seemed to dissolve as Harold found himself smiling despite his professional reserve. "Beautiful animal," he murmured, almost to himself. "Remarkably well socialized for her age." Esperanza, seeing her daughter's interaction with the inspector, finally relaxed. She stepped back, allowing Harold access to the stall, though her watchful eyes never left him. The inspection continued, but something had shifted in Harold's demeanor. He still made notes, still measured and examined, but there was a thoughtfulness in his approach that had not been there before. When they finally emerged from the barn, Victor was waiting with barely concealed impatience. "Well," he demanded, "what did you find?" Harold Winters looked at Victor for a long moment, something flickering behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Then he turned to Thomas, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Mitchell, I found no violations on this property. In fact, the care and maintenance here exceed county standards in several areas." He flipped through his notes. "Your documentation is thorough, your facilities are clean and properly maintained, and your animals appear healthy and well treated." He paused, glancing back at the barn where Esperanza's dark head was visible through the doorway. "That mare of yours is quite something. There's an intelligence in her eyes that I've rarely seen." Victor's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. "Surely there must be something," he pressed. "The waste management, the water quality, the structural integrity of the buildings." Harold fixed him with a steady gaze. "Mr. Harmon, anonymous complaints are taken seriously by this office, but they must be based on legitimate concerns. I've found no evidence supporting the allegations in this case." He tucked his clipboard under his arm. "I should mention that filing false complaints is a misuse of county resources. Should a pattern of unfounded complaints emerge, there could be consequences." The warning hung in the air as Harold shook Thomas's hand and departed, leaving Victor standing alone in the driveway, his schemes unraveling around him. Victor Harmon was not a man accustomed to defeat, and the failed inspection only served to fuel his determination. In the days that followed, Thomas noticed subtle changes around his property that spoke of a predator circling its prey. Tire tracks appeared on the back roads bordering his land, evidence of vehicles that had no business being there. Strange sounds punctuated the night, unexplained disturbances that sent Esperanza into fits of nervous whinnying. Most troubling of all, Thomas discovered that someone had been tampering with his water supply, adding sediment to the pipes that fed his troughs. The sabotage was minor, easily corrected, but its message was clear. Victor would not stop until he had what he wanted. The community rallied even closer around Thomas, their support transforming from passive sympathy to active resistance. Farmers who had long harbored grudges against Victor's expansionist ambitions began sharing stories of their own encounters with the man's ruthless tactics. It seemed that Thomas was not the first to face Victor's campaign of intimidation, merely the latest in a long line of neighbors who had been pressured, harassed, and ultimately driven from their land. Some had sold out, accepting Victor's offers rather than continue fighting. Others had simply walked away, abandoning properties that had been in their families for generations. But a few had stood firm, and these battle-hardened survivors now formed the core of a resistance movement that was growing stronger by the day. Sheriff Henderson intensified his patrols, his deputies becoming a regular presence on the roads surrounding the Mitchell Ranch. The lawman had been gathering evidence quietly, building a case against Victor that he hoped would eventually bring the wealthy rancher to justice. But Victor was careful, always operating through intermediaries, never leaving fingerprints on the dirty work that advanced his interests. The frustration was evident in Henderson's voice when he stopped by to update Thomas on the investigation. "He's slippery, Thomas. Every time we get close, the trail goes cold. But he's getting careless, pushing too hard. Men like that always make mistakes eventually." Through it all, Esperanza remained Thomas's steadfast companion and protector. The mayor had developed an uncanny ability to sense danger, alerting Thomas to potential threats with a system of whinnies and behavioral cues that he had learned to interpret. She would pace along the fence line when strangers approached, stamp her hooves when vehicles lingered too long on the road, and position herself between hope and any perceived threat, with the unwavering dedication of a mother defending her young. Thomas often marveled at her vigilance, wondering if her brush with death had somehow heightened her awareness of the fragility of life and the dangers that threatened it. Hope was growing rapidly, her silver-gray coat developing the lustrous sheen that marked her as Esperanza's daughter. At 4 months old, she had already begun showing signs of the remarkable intelligence that defined her mother. She would watch Thomas work around the ranch, her bright eyes following his movements with obvious interest. When he spoke to her, she would tilt her head as if genuinely trying to understand his words. Most remarkably, she had developed a habit of warning Thomas when Esperanza detected something amiss, running to him and nudging his legs with urgent persistence until he followed her back to her mother. The three of them had become a team, a family bound not by blood, but by something far more powerful. It was Hope who first alerted Thomas to the fire. The night had been quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that usually promised restful sleep. Thomas had retired early, exhausted from the constant vigilance that had become his daily routine. He was deep in dreams when the sound of hooves pounding against the barn door jolted him awake. He stumbled to the window, his heart already racing with premonition, and saw Hope standing in the moonlight, her small body trembling with agitation. Behind her, an orange glow was beginning to illuminate the eastern sky, coming from the direction of the equipment shed. Thomas was out of the house in seconds, grabbing the fire extinguisher from the kitchen as he ran. The shed was fully engulfed by the time he reached it, flames licking toward the sky with hungry intensity. He fought desperately to contain the blaze, but it was hopeless. The dry timber and stored fuel fed the fire like kindling, and within minutes the structure collapsed in a shower of sparks and ash. Thomas stood watching, the fire extinguisher hanging uselessly at his side as years of accumulated equipment and memories were consumed by the flames. The heat scorched his face, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on a single terrible question. Had Hope not awakened him, would the fire have spread to the barn where Esperanza slept? The fire department arrived too late to save the shed, but managed to prevent the flames from spreading to other structures. As the firefighters worked, Thomas walked to the barn where Esperanza and Hope were waiting. The mare was agitated, pacing in her stall with the nervous energy of a creature who understood how close they had come to disaster. Hope pressed against her mother's side, seeking comfort from the only security she knew. Thomas opened the stall door and stepped inside, gathering both horses into an embrace that communicated what words could not. They had survived, but the attack had made one thing clear. Victor Harmon was no longer content with intimidation. He was willing to destroy. Sheriff Henderson arrived as the last embers were being extinguished. His face was grim as he surveyed the damage, his flashlight beam revealing the unmistakable signs of arson. Accelerant had been poured around the base of the shed, the char patterns leaving no doubt that this was deliberate. "This changes everything," he told Thomas, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Arson is a felony, Thomas. If we can tie this to Victor, he's going away for a long time." Thomas nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the smoldering ruins of the shed. Somewhere in there lay the tractor Margaret had learned to drive, the tools her father had passed down to them, the carefully maintained equipment that represented a lifetime of honest labor. All of it was gone now, sacrificed to one man's greed. But as the sun began to rise over the devastated property, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas felt something unexpected stirring within him. It was not defeat or despair, but a fierce, burning determination that seemed to radiate from his very core. Victor Harmon had miscalculated. He had thought that destruction would break Thomas's spirit, would finally convince him to surrender. Instead, it had awakened something that had been dormant since Margaret's death, a fighting spirit that would not be extinguished by any fire. As Esperanza nickered softly behind him, Thomas made a silent vow. This war was not over. It had only just begun. The investigation into the arson moved quickly in the days that followed. Sheriff Henderson, galvanized by the escalation of violence, devoted every available resource to building a case against Victor Harmon. Forensic teams combed through the wreckage of the equipment shed, collecting samples of the accelerant and documenting evidence with meticulous care. Neighbors came forward with information they had previously been too afraid to share, accounts of threats and intimidation that painted a damning picture of Victor's methods. The wealthy rancher, accustomed to operating in shadows, suddenly found himself exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny. His lawyers worked frantically to distance him from the crime, but the walls were closing in. Thomas threw himself into the work of rebuilding, channeling his anger into productive action. Donations poured in from across the community, enough to replace the destroyed equipment and then some. Volunteers arrived daily, helping to clear debris and constructed a new shed that would be larger and more secure than its predecessor. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, a testament to the bonds that held the community together in times of crisis. Thomas accepted each offer of help with humble gratitude, knowing that he could never have survived this ordeal alone. The Mitchell Ranch, once a quiet refuge from the world, had become a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for everyone who had ever suffered under Victor Harmon's predatory ambitions. Esperanza watched the reconstruction with what Thomas could only describe as approval. The mare had been shaken by the fire, her normally calm demeanor giving way to a heightened vigilance that kept her constantly alert. She would not rest until hope was safely beside her, and even then, her eyes continued to scan the horizon for signs of danger. Thomas understood her fear. The fire had come too close to the barn, too close to the family she had fought so hard to protect. But there was something else in Esperanza's gaze now, a steely determination that mirrored Thomas's own resolve. They had faced death together, had stared into the abyss, and emerged stronger. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way. It was during this period of rebuilding that an unexpected ally emerged. Harold Winters, the inspector whose visit had nearly destroyed them, appeared at the ranch one afternoon with a box of files tucked under his arm. His face was drawn, the weight of conscience evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes. He approached Thomas with the hesitant steps of a man seeking redemption. The files, he explained, contained documentation of every complaint Victor Harmon had filed over the years, dozens of anonymous reports targeting ranchers who had refused his offers. The pattern was undeniable, a systematic campaign of harassment that had driven family after family from their land. Harold had kept copies of everything, troubled by what he witnessed but too afraid to act. The fire had changed that. Thomas accepted the files with hands that trembled slightly, understanding the magnitude of what Harold was offering. This was the evidence Sheriff Henderson needed, the paper trail that would connect Victor to years of criminal harassment. "Why now?" Thomas asked, searching the inspector's face for answers. Harold looked toward the barn, where Esperanza and Hope stood watching them with quiet attention. "That mare of yours," he said softly. "The way she looked at me during the inspection, it was like she could see right through me, see all the times I looked the other way. All the people I failed by staying silent." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't live with that anymore." The files proved to be the breakthrough the investigation needed. Combined with the physical evidence from the arson and the testimonies of neighbors, they presented an irrefutable case against Victor Harmon. Sheriff Henderson obtained a warrant within days, and the arrest was made on a crisp autumn morning that seemed to herald the changing of seasons in more ways than one. Thomas watched from his porch as the patrol cars rolled past his property, heading toward Victor's estate with lights flashing. There was no satisfaction in the moment, only a profound sense of relief that the nightmare was finally ending. Justice, long delayed, was at last being served. The news of Victor's arrest spread through the community like a healing balm. Ranchers who had lived in fear for years finally felt safe enough to tell their stories, their voices adding to the chorus of testimony that would ensure Victor never terrorized anyone again. The trial, when it came, was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Victor's lawyers negotiated a plea deal that would send their client to prison for a minimum of 15 years. The judge, a weathered woman who had presided over the county courts for 3 decades, delivered her sentence with words that resonated throughout the courtroom. "Mr. Harmon, you used your wealth and influence to prey upon honest, hard-working people. You destroyed lives and livelihoods without remorse. Today, that ends." Thomas did not attend the sentencing. Instead, he spent the morning in the pasture with Esperanza and Hope, watching the sun rise over the hills that Margaret had loved so much. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, leaves beginning to turn colors that would soon set the landscape ablaze with beauty. He thought of everything that had happened since that terrible night when Esperanza had fought death to bring hope into the world. So much pain, so much struggle, yet here they stood, stronger than ever. The land that Victor had coveted remained in Mitchell hands, and now it always would. Esperanza moved closer, her warm breath creating small clouds in the cool morning air. Thomas reached out to stroke her neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath his fingers. "We did it, girl," he whispered. "We actually did it." The mare nickered softly in response, her dark eyes reflecting the golden light of dawn. Hope pranced nearby, her youthful energy a constant reminder that life continues, that hope persists even in the darkest times. Thomas smiled, feeling a peace settle over him that had been absent for far too long. The battle was over, but the living went on. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the stars emerge one by one, he felt Margaret's presence more strongly than he had in years. The wildflower scent drifted on the breeze, and somewhere in the pasture, Esperanza whinnied softly, as if greeting an old friend. Thomas closed his eyes and let the tears come, tears of grief and gratitude mingling together. "Thank you," he whispered to the night. "Thank you for sending them to me." The stars twinkled overhead, and in their light, Thomas could almost see Margaret smiling down at them all. 5 years passed like water flowing through the creek that bordered the Mitchell Ranch, each season bringing its own gifts and challenges. The land that had witnessed so much struggle and triumph continued to flourish under Thomas's careful stewardship, its pastures greener than ever, its fences strong and well-maintained. The new equipment shed stood proudly where its predecessor had fallen, a symbol of resilience that visitors often remarked upon. But the true heart of the ranch remained unchanged, centered always around the bond between a man and the horses who had taught him how to live again. Thomas Mitchell, once broken by grief and nearly destroyed by greed, had emerged from his trials transformed into something stronger, something beautiful. Esperanza had aged gracefully, her black coat now streaked with silver that caught the light like strands of wisdom woven through her mane. At 15 years old, she moved more slowly than before, her steps measured and deliberate, but her eyes retained the fierce intelligence that had defined her throughout her remarkable life. She spent her days in peaceful contentment, grazing in the pastures she had fought so hard to protect, watching over the ranch with the quiet vigilance of a guardian who had earned her rest. The mare who had defied death itself had become a legend in the community, her story told and retold until it had taken on the quality of myth. Yet to Thomas, she was simply Esperanza, his faithful companion, the bridge between his past sorrows and his present joys. Hope had grown into a magnificent horse, her silver-gray coat gleaming with health and vitality. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and spirit, combined with a playful nature that brought laughter to everyone who encountered her. Thomas had trained her carefully, using gentle methods that respected her individuality and nurtured her trust. She had become an accomplished trail horse, carrying visitors through the scenic hills that surrounded the ranch with a sure-footedness that spoke of her deep connection to the land. But her greatest achievement was something that could not be measured in ribbons or competitions. Hope had become a therapy horse, working with children and veterans who came to the ranch seeking healing from their own traumas. The therapy program had started small, an idea born from Thomas's own experience of healing through his relationship with Esperanza. He had partnered with local hospitals and veterans organizations, offering free sessions to those who might benefit from time spent with the horses. The results had exceeded everyone's expectations. Children who had withdrawn into silence began speaking again after sessions with Hope. Veterans haunted by memories of war found peace in the rhythmic motion of riding through quiet forests. The ranch had become a sanctuary, a place where broken spirits came to be mended by the unconditional love that animals offer so freely. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, had become the program's unofficial grandmother, greeting visitors with fresh-baked cookies and stories of the miracle that had started it all. She would sit on the porch with Thomas in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed to grow more beautiful with each passing year. They would talk about Margaret, about Esperanza's miraculous birth, about all the lives that had been touched by hope in its many forms. These conversations had become sacred rituals, moments of reflection that reminded Thomas of how far he had traveled from the dark days when grief had threatened to consume him entirely. One autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted lazily from the trees, Thomas walked to the pasture where Esperanza stood watching the horizon. The mare turned at his approach, her dark eyes meeting his with the understanding that had always existed between them. Thomas reached out to stroke her neck, feeling the familiar warmth of her coat beneath his fingers. "You know, girl," he said softly, "I never told you this, but that night when you were fighting to bring hope into the world, I almost gave up. The doctor said you wouldn't survive, and part of me wanted to believe him. It would have been easier to accept the loss than to hope for a miracle." Esperanza turned her head, her soft muzzle brushing against his cheek in the gesture that had become their private language of love. Thomas smiled, tears gathering in his eyes. "But you wouldn't let me give up, would you? You showed me that hope is worth fighting for, even when everything seems impossible. You taught me that love is stronger than death, stronger than fear, stronger than anything the world can throw at us." He paused, looking out at the land that held so many memories. "Margaret would be so proud of you, Esperanza. She would be proud of all of us." As if in answer, a gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wildflowers. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel Margaret's presence one more time. In the distance, Hope whinnied, her voice carrying across the pasture like a song of joy. The sound brought a smile to Thomas's face, a reminder that life continues, that each ending contains the seed of a new beginning. He had lost so much, but he had gained something infinitely precious. He had learned that miracles are possible, that love transcends all boundaries, and that hope, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished. The story of Esperanza and hope spread far beyond the small Montana community where it began. People from across the country came to visit the ranch, drawn by the tale of a mare who had refused to die and the man who had refused to give up on her. Each visitor left with something precious, a reminder that the world is filled with wonder for those willing to see it. And in the pasture, as the sun set over the hills and the stars began to emerge, a black mare and her silver daughter stood side by side, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. They were a testament to the power of love, a living proof that miracles happen every day to those who believe. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Let me know where in the world you're watching from, and tell me if you have ever witnessed a miracle of love in your own life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Remember, in a world that often seems dark, hope is always waiting to be found. Until next time, may you carry the spirit of Esperanza in your heart, and may you never stop believing in miracles.